Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Before this video officially gets underway, I just want to give you a sense of the tools that I am using to make it, because I think it's a little bit important so that you can understand the sorts of control inputs and how I'm actually making them with my equipment. So this is the Thrustmaster TSPC Racer wheel servo base, and it's being used in conjunction with this, the Thrustmaster Ferrari 599XX Evo Alcantara rim. That's a mouthful and a half, but this rim, first of all, it is a very nice rim. It's 30 centimeters in diameter, so measuring from here to here, and its widest points, 30 centimeters. It is completely wrapped in Alcantara, and it's very high quality fabric as well, I must say. It's very smooth, very suave to the touch, and also it squeezes a little bit. There's a little bit of padding there, so it's very nice to touch, really, and it feels very nice in your hand. It's almost a pity to wear gloves. You've seen this wheel before in some videos. However, just want to give you a little bit of a closer look. In contrast to the Ferrari F1 rim, also by Thrustmaster, that you'll see in a couple of minutes, this one is a lot simpler, and it obviously it's based on a road car steering wheel, and it's a whole lot more simple. It's very much like a road car steering wheel that you might see, and this one actually has fewer functions than some road car steering wheels nowadays. But just to give you a sense of what's going on here, you can see all of the buttons here. We have 6 buttons here, traditional toggle push buttons there, and then we have a rotary switch here in the bottom right, labeled main, and has a push button function as well. So for Assetto Corsa, the way that I have these buttons mapped out is thus. Here I have brake bias adjustments. This is increment on the right and decrement on the left. If you've got 2 hands on the wheel, very easily reachable with your thumbs there, as it's basically designed. These buttons here, they don't really have too much of a use, actually. Depending on the kind of car I'm driving, I might map them to the horn or the headlights, something like that. But for the most part, the kinds of cars that you're going to use this rim with are not that technical, not that complicated, so you don't need as many of the functions. You could also map these to turbocharger if you want. I haven't really driven too many of the turbo cars lately, so maybe this could be increment and decrement boost, something like that. But pretty open there in terms of the functionalities. Down here, for cars that have a KERS boost, I would put the KERS boost here. So La Ferrari, FXXK, McLaren P1, things of that nature would have that mapped right there. This one here is, this would be for different mappings for that KERS deploy. Again, mostly just FXXK that you can play with that. Over here, the last thing on the face of the wheel, this rotary switch, this is a traction control adjustment right in here. So increment and decrement there to the left. 2 button functions there with that rotation, and then it's a push button function as well. And this I have mapped to the headlights. On the back of the wheel, we've got these 2 very nice paddle shifters that you can see. They're all in brushed aluminum, as is the face of the wheel itself. Very nice. Up on the right, down on the left. Unlike what you're about to see on the Ferrari wheel, the F1 wheel rather, these are not a rocker switch, so they are independent of each other, but just very nice. Give you an overhead view here, and you can hear just how quiet they are. So if you are driving at night and perhaps there are other people in the house, this might be your rim of choice. It's just very quiet, and you do a lot of gear changing, so very quiet and very nice action on these paddles as well, particularly the downshift one. It's a little bit heavier than the upshift one, and just great tactile feedback there. You know you've done a gear change. Very nicely done. The last function on the wheel, this 8-function D-pad, up, down, left, right, and then you can sort of blend the functions in like this. Essentially identical to the button layout on the stock TSPC rim, but this is what we're going to be using for the Williams FW14, and then next you're going to have a look at the Ferrari F1 rim that we'll be using for Formula Hybrid in this video. Here on the Ferrari F1 wheel by Thrustmaster, we have a whole bunch of different buttons, switches, and selectors here, and all of these are critical in terms of being able to drive one of the modern cars like Formula Hybrid. So here, first of all, we have the wheel itself, we have the rim here, hand grips, your hands slot into them like this. I would like a slightly larger hand grip, just my personal taste. The stock TSPC Racer rim is a lot better for my hands, but this is what you've got, so you've got to deal with it. Over on the top of the wheel, we'll start with these here. We have the K button. This is for your manual KERS or ERS deploy, whatever you have. And then over here on the right, PL. This would be mapped to pit lane speed limiter. However, in Assetto Corsa, I don't use it because I have all of the functions taken care of already with the other systems. Here, this is labeled diff in, but in Assetto Corsa, I use it for brake bias, so up for forward and down for rearward. Over here, charge. This is for my recovery rate on the rear axle for the MGU K recovery. So this will cycle between 0 and 100. Up is up and down is down for that. Over in the center of the wheel here, the N button here, this is another disused function on this steering wheel because I've just got all of the buttons already mapped out to what I like. So this would be for neutral in the real car, however, unused in Assetto Corsa. I do use it in iRacing and R-Factor as well. Over here, the pit button, this would be pit confirm in the real car. However, this is mapped to traction control settings for Assetto Corsa. Here is another traction control setting. This is increased traction control, and here the pump, which would be used for the auxiliary oil pump in the real car. This is decreased traction control for me. Down here, we've got a D-pad. This is the one that's going to select all of my pit options in Assetto Corsa, so up, down, left, and right, as you can see there. Over on the right-hand side of the wheel, DRS. That's for our DRS flap open and closed there. Also closes when you get on the brakes. Here we've got our plus 10 and minus 1 in the real car. This would be for cycling through different dash modes so you can select different sensors and things. However, in Assetto Corsa, this is for my MGU deploy settings, so cycles up and cycles down. Here, labeled BP. However, here this is another POV hat switch for function. However, here in Assetto Corsa, I use it for engine braking, going up and down, and then left and right. This is for turbocharger deploy on the boost pressure. At the bottom, these three switches. Here, this is my MGU H mode, so this cycles between motor and battery. You notice it toggles up and down, but it's the same button in either the up or down toggle, so it's a single function regardless of the direction that you throw it. Here in Assetto Corsa, this is for the headlights in cars that have headlights, so on-off, quite simple. And here in Assetto Corsa, this is for the horn, simply because I don't have any other function to use it with. This headlight switch would also be for the rain light in the cars that have a rain light you can use. On the back of the steering wheel, of course, you've got your paddles. So up on the right, down on the left, and you'll also notice it's a rocker switch. So you are able to upshift with your left hand and downshift with your right hand if you want, just by pushing the paddle rather than pulling it. These functions here in the center of the wheel, these are all for show. These are just slightly raised sections on the wheel. They don't actually turn or do anything. Same thing with the Ferrari logo here. This would be a rotary switch in the real car used in conjunction with these buttons here, plus 10, minus 1. However, just for show here on the Thrustmaster version. Also, no lights or anything else across the top, just a metal plate, Thrustmaster, and then you see the decals ready, RF on, state of charge, K on. Those are all things pertinent to the real car, but not here on this wheel. But that's the skinny on what I've got going on here for Assetto Corsa and the Ferrari rim. Now, of course, on to the action.
Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, namely, what are some of the differences that we get when driving older cars, specifically Formula One cars, most specifically this 1991 Williams FW14. In my videos, you see me drive a whole host of different cars of different types from different eras, and each one is a snowflake, we might say. Every car is unique in its tendencies and its capabilities, so today I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you will notice going between different cars, particularly cars of a similar type but from very different eras. So the FW14 is our test bed today for this little endeavor. What we're going to do now is go back into the pits and go over what we've got going on with our setup. The default setup here loaded onto the car, and the engine comes back to life there for a moment. You can see with the default setup when I loaded it, the front end of the car in particular went up in the air quite a bit, and that's because I just tend to like to dial in a fair amount of rake onto a car because I like the front end to be very, very pointy. On this particular car by ASR in 0.3 beta, there is a little bit of a graphical glitch wherein the little venturi tunnels underneath the front wing will sort of morph into the track surface when the nose drops a little bit too low. This can happen as the download comes through the suspension through downforce as the car increases speed. It can also happen in bumps on the road or in crests in the road, things like that. So it's a little bit of a graphical gremlin. However, it does not appear to impact the car's performance at all. So that's something that you might see when we dial that rake back into the car. Going into the setup that I like, we'll go to our setup screen first on the suspension side, and just to show you what everything's going on, note our ride heights there, 21 all around. When we go back in and load in the setup that I like, you see a lot of rake comes into the car first off, but we'll go back to that suspension screen once again. And you'll see that the front ride height is significantly lower than the rear now. 4 on the front and 21 on the rear. So keeping the rear ride height at default and obviously much higher than the front. And this is to accelerate air underneath the car and generate downforce using the underbody. That's all pretty self-explanatory and common practice in Formula One past and present. However, getting back on topic here, what do we look for when we go between cars of different eras of the same type? Obviously, this is a Formula One car, and it actually has quite a lot in common with the Formula One cars of today. It's pretty wide, you'll notice. It also, and we'll go out here into the pit lane proper just to give you a better look, it's pretty wide. So the dimensions are quite similar, at least in terms of width, to the modern cars. We have large wings, front and rear. We have side pods housing radiators, we have an air intake above the driver's head there, and we have very large, slick tires. Again, this is a feature that we're seeing once again in 2017 that's obviously going to help mechanical grip a lot. However, returning to the aerodynamic side on this, you'll see those wings that we mentioned. Yes, they're very big and they're very prominent. However, when we compare them to the wings that we see today, they are very simple. Here on this Williams, we just have a double element front wing. We have a relatively neutral lower section there. It just raises slightly in the middle to meet up with the nose cone. And then the part of the wing that generates most of our topside aero is this secondary flap that is angled upward. You can see it begins with the Goodyear branding there, and then it continues up through a gurney flap at the top of the wing, and it just is what it is. It's very simplistic by modern standards, however it was effective back in the 90s. It's a very similar story here on the rear, where you can see it's a double element rear wing. We have that lower beam wing, and then we have the upper flap, which is generating most of our rear downforce. You can see that flap has 2 elements to it. That is just to facilitate the adjustability of that flap in terms of different circuits with different downforce requirements. Obviously, at a place like Spa, you would want lower downforce than a place like Monaco. Such is the track layout. However, the overall mechanics of that aerodynamic and of that downforce are quite similar to today. We have a diffuser section here at the rear, much larger than what we see today in terms of its overall area occupied on the car, but some design elements are quite similar. You can see these tunnels underneath in the diffuser, these strakes coming down just to help clean that airflow up and condition it as it exits the car. And of course, the whole rationale of the diffuser is to take that high pressure, high speed flow underneath and slow it down a little bit so it expands outward so you get some negative pressure out the back of the car. That's how it works, and that's how it still works today. Back into the pit lane in the setup screen. And you can see that all the camera and toe adjustments are still pretty much default. Again, I've just added some rake to the car just to give a little bit more pointiness on the front end. We'll put a bit of fuel on board now. And we'll keep the soft tires on, 19 PSI all around. So here in the cockpit, big differences from what we see in the modern era. Also some big differences in terms of the car systems. You'll know from a couple of my videos where I've done some split screen views with my actual wheel versus the onboards, you'll know that I have an assortment of Thrustmaster rims, including the Ferrari Formula One rim that's modeled after the 2011 Ferrari car, the F150. And for most modern Formula One cars and other open-wheeled cars, that's the rim of choice because it has all the buttons and things that I need to monitor and to manage all of the car's different systems. However, with this one, I am using the 599XX Evo Alcantara rim. It doesn't have as many buttons on it, but this car doesn't have as many functions. Namely, it doesn't have things like KERS, DRS, the MGU systems, all of that. It's quite simply up and down with the paddles, stop and go with the gas and the brake, and then of course you've got a clutch as well. And that's basically it. You've also got brake bias adjustments in the car that of course you can use. However, as you can see as I scroll through some of the buttons here, no MGU, no traction control, nothing like that. So not as much to worry about in that regard. Hence, you can use a simpler rim if you have the option. Otherwise, in terms of the things that you're going to need to think about while you're out on track, there's not as much in here, so you can focus more on driving. I do find these earlier cars extending from all the way back to the 1950s and all the way up to the mid-90s to be very much focused on the driver, and the driver makes a big difference in these cars, as we shall see. Heading out of the pits here at Spa. Get up through the box here. And another difference that you will see in this car versus some of the more modern ones, a 6-speed gearbox. This one has a lot in common, as I said before, with modern cars in many ways. Another way that it has some common roots is with the gearbox. Yes, only a 6-speed unit versus the 8-speed units that we see today. However, this one is semi-automatic. 1991 was one of the last years where we had some of that comorbidity, I guess we can say, or concurrence with semi-automatic and manual gearboxes in Formula One. McLaren, for example, in the MP46 still had an H-pattern manual, whereas Williams and Ferrari were using the semi-automatic paddle shift solution. Ferrari had brought that out all the way back in 1989. So by 1991, a couple other teams, namely Williams, had gone on board with that technology and started to explore it and started to utilize it. Because of that, that does mean that that's another area of familiarity that you have in these older cars versus a modern one. One of the big differences, though, and we mentioned this before briefly, we have a normally aspirated engine in this car with no hybrid powertrains whatsoever. Hybrid technology was effectively unheard of in the early 90s, and especially in racing. Therefore, we have a 3-liter V10 engine in the back of this thing, and it's normally aspirated. No turbochargers, no hybrid assistance to help you out, just about 730 or so horsepower underneath your right foot, and that is about it. Therefore, in terms of monitoring the engine, basically the only things that you're going to do are think about the revs every once in a while. If you're having some fuel consumption issues or some reliability concerns, you're going to want to make sure that you don't rev it out quite as high, all the way up to about the 13,500 RPM red line on this thing. Other than that, though, that's it. The engine does its thing, and the gearbox does its thing, and you just tell it when to upshift and downshift. That's about it. No clutch, no lifting, no problem. As we head down the Kemmel Straight here, reading 197 miles per hour, still climbing a little bit before we brake for Les Combes. You'll notice that straight line speed going back 25 years is not a concern. It is still very comparable to what the cars are achieving nowadays, particularly back in 2016, last year, where we were seeing some of the highest straight line speeds we've ever seen in Formula One, particularly at the Mexican Grand Prix with the slightly thinner air up there in Mexico City. So straight line speed is not something that has changed all that much in the last 2.5 decades. Something that has changed an awful lot, though, and we talked about this a little bit talking about the wings, is aerodynamics. This car, very much a topside car. Those big front and rear wings, although they are somewhat simplistic by modern standards, they are generating most of your downforce. There's also a lot of downforce in this era, the early 90s, coming from the under tray, because unlike today and unlike all the Formula One cars since 1994, this car has a flat bottom. It does not have the step plane that we've been used to seeing since 1994, which was a safety feature that the FIA introduced to try and cut downforce and therefore cornering speeds. So this one has a little bit more aero balance on the bottom side versus the top side, although the top side is still the most effective area in producing downforce for this car. However, for this, it does mean that the car has a little bit more grip in high-speed corners than some of its immediate predecessors, namely the late 80s turbo-era cars. Most of that has to do with the advancement in the wing design, and also some of the the less restrictive packaging concerns that you get with a normally aspirated engine versus a turbocharged one, because you don't have to worry about where you're going to put things like turbochargers, wastegates, and intercoolers. So you can make that Coke bottle section of the car a little bit more narrow, therefore that's going to free up some more room for things like radiators and routing airflow around the center section of the car, which is very critical for that underbody downforce generation. Because the car is a little bit easier to manage, though, in terms of that engine, you're not worried about KERS, you're not worried about regen off the rear axle, you're not worried about how do you adjust your brake bias in relation to however you adjust your regen. The car is a lot easier to operate than a modern one. There are simply not as many things going on. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it's any easier to drive. Formula One cars, no matter what era they're from, are designed to do one thing really, really well, and that's to go around corners. Just like in the modern era, this one does that. Judging from its time, it was the fastest Formula One car of its era. In 1991, it was not the most reliable, hence McLaren were able to win both championships that year. However, 1992 with the FW14B and 1993 with the FW15C, this was the dominant package. So for 2 years, Williams really at the top in the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. Nigel Mansell in 1992 and Alain Prost in 1993 with this package here. So this, just like one of the cars that we'll see in 2017, most likely either the Ferrari or the Mercedes, this one absolutely at the top of its game and designed to do that one thing really, really well, go around corners as fast as possible. Some of the differences, though, that you will start to spot as we're going around here, around the top of the circuit, now starting to plunge downhill, you will see that some of the control inputs that you use in these cars vary somewhat significantly from what you'll see me use in, say, Formula Hybrid, which is the closest we can get on Assetto Corsa right now to a realistic 2017 Formula One car. You'll notice the way I use the throttle in this car is significantly different to the way that I tend to use it in Formula Hybrid. Here, you'll see that I stab at the throttle quite a bit because that engine, normally aspirated, no turbo, it is producing full power at full throttle all the time. No turbochargers to have to spool up or spool down, no wastegates to have to dump boost pressure and things like that. So this engine is always on song no matter where it is. It generates maximum horsepower at around 12.5 to 13,000 RPM. Max torque comes a bit lower than that at around 9,000 RPM. But that does mean that you are always in the power band. You never really drop below 9,000 RPM too often when you're driving this car around most circuits. Right here, drop down to about 6, but then immediately the revs pick up in a flash. I would say less than a second between 6 and 9,000 RPM, and there you go, back on the power. It's very linear, it's very tractable, it's very predictable. Just like a modern car, no traction control or anything like that to worry about. If you go back a little bit deeper into history, back into the mid-2000s, you will get traction control, and that's something that you do have to manage. However, it's really not something that you play with all that much during a stint. Yes, you do play with it as the tires wear down and somewhat as your fuel load changes throughout the race, depending on what your needs are for your stint, if you're heavy or light. But for the most part, it's something that you set once and then you essentially forget about it. Here, though, we're not dealing with it. Another thing that you will see, particularly through these high-speed corners such as Pouhon, there's just not as much downforce as there is today. And because of that, you will notice that your speeds through the corners are slower than you will get in a modern car. This is indicative of progress, and we love to see progress not only in motorsport, but in pretty much any other pursuit that humanity takes on. However, lower cornering speeds due to that lower downforce. We're talking about 25 years of history here, 25 years of research, design, development, and innovation. Therefore, that equals lap time. Formula Hybrid can easily do a lap around Spa in the mid 1 minute 40s. This one struggles quite a bit to keep it below 1 minute 50. And as you can see, that lap time there, 150.770. So there is some time to be had here. Some of the other things about driving an older car versus a newer one that might not be so obvious are, ironically enough, the things immediately in front of us. Namely, how do things look out the cockpit? The view that we have right now is significantly different than what you get in a modern car. In a modern car, the cockpit literally envelops the driver, basically up to his eye line. A lot of people throughout the years have criticized Formula One car design in terms of being too restrictive visually, so that it's more difficult to see what the drivers are doing as they're going around on track. It's more difficult to see the driver's arm movement, I remember people talking about from the 90s. However, here in 1991, although far more of a closed cockpit than we saw certainly in the very old days, talking back in the 50s and 60s here when the drivers effectively sat on top of the cars, look at how open this is. The cockpit sides, yes, they're there. They do offer some degree of protection. However, the driver is still very much exposed in this car. The sills only go up roughly to the driver's shoulders, so the tops of his shoulders, the tops of his arms, his neck, and his head are completely exposed to the outside world here. And that does not offer all that much in terms of protection. However, it does offer quite a lot in terms of visibility, and as you can see, we've run out of fuel here. I thought maybe we could squeak out that last lap to get back to the pits. However, it seems that we cannot, and we're not going to make the pit lane at this point. However, you can see, just to finish the point on that cockpit visibility, all of that space, if you look out across the front suspension of the car there, you can see both of the suspension elements there. You can see the push rods, you can see the upper and lower wishbones. The mirrors, you can see where they attach to the side of the chassis, and you get great visibility rearward. You can see almost the entirety of the front wheels, and you can even see the end plates of the front wing. So you know exactly where you're placing this car. In a modern car, you're almost sort of looking over the top of it, almost like looking through a letterbox in a front door. It's very difficult sometimes to place the car in terms of what is exactly in front of it. No such problems in this. You know exactly where you are on the track in relation to your front wing all the time. And this plays into how you approach driving this car in a race situation, because you know where you can attack, where you can't. You know exactly how close you are to the guy in front. There's no guesswork whatsoever. Going back into the pits here because we very amateurishly run out of fuel. Put some more into it. We go back on song. But you can see here, just after driving this car for a couple of laps, I have not had to make any adjustments to it. There's no traction control to play with, there's no MGU, nothing of the sort. Basically, you set the car up in the pits, you go out, you drive some laps. If you don't like what you feel, you go back to the pits and you change some things, and then you go back out on track to see if you've made any headway on your setup difficulties. There's not so much that you can do from the cockpit in this car, and that would change big time starting in 1992 when Williams introduced the active suspension, which is something that we don't have in the modern era, although, depending on which sources you read, there might be some talk about bringing it back in some form at some later date. However, at this time, this car is still traditional, what they were calling a passive car in the day, because there were some active suspension systems being trialed in this era, even in 1991, and everybody knew Williams was working on it anyway. However, like I said, you get in it and you drive it, and a lot of the performance potential of this car falls back onto the driver in terms of making it work well. So that is another thing that separates this era and this car from a modern one, say 2017. because the modern cars are so complicated from an electronics and mechanical standpoint, there are so many more variables thrown into the equation that ultimately dictate what the level of performance is. We all know what the problems McLaren are facing with that Honda power unit, the hybrid system, the turbocharger. Pretty much everything on that car is wrong. But the chassis is good, at least from what the very brief moment of success in the second day of the Bahrain test told us. When the McLaren is running decently, it's running decently. It's not too bad. They look to be about on par with Williams, if not maybe able to challenge Red Bull if they have reliability and good horsepower. So you can see there that the driver doesn't have so much influence in that because there are just so many points of failure on a modern Formula One car. These cars, yes, the 90s were not the most reliable era in the world, but the cars were a whole lot more simple. Yes, the FW14 very quickly became the most complicated Formula One car ever built up to that point in its FW15 guise. However, still, it's a driver, it's an engine, it's a steering wheel, and it's a gearbox. And the gearbox is semi-automatic anyway, so there's not a whole lot going on here, which also means there's not a whole lot that can go wrong. So the emphasis on driver skill in this era, and it's no accident that we still look at some of these guys from the early 90s, Mansell, Senna, Berger, Schumacher to an extent, and we look at them as heroes because it really was down to how good the drivers were back then. Because the cars were simple enough, they were reliable enough, and it allowed a driver to really showcase his talent. Or in the cases of some other drivers back then, to showcase his lack of talent. There were a lot of drivers who participated in Formula One in the 90s, particularly the early 90s. Yes, I'm talking about life. Yes, when the car wasn't good, it really wasn't good, and when the drivers weren't good, they really were not good either. The other differences, though, from a driving standpoint, aside from the simplicity, aside from the relative reliability and ease of use, just your information, the way that you get information in a car like this is a little bit different from a modern one. There aren't as many sensors, there aren't as many LCD screens and things staring you in the face all the time, showing you tons of data. You can see there, just in front of the steering wheel, is a traditional dashboard. And this is a feature that some Formula One cars still have, namely Williams. But you can see here we have a rev counter, which is an actual graphical rev counter. We have speed just below it, we have lap time, we have best lap time, or last lap time rather, and we have a current lap delta and a fuel level, and that's it. Not a whole lot of information being fed to the driver. You've got a gear indicator in red up at the top just above the steering wheel rim, partially obscured thereby. However, it really comes down to, once again, the driver's skill and the driver's judgment. You have to listen to the engine to know when to shift. You've got to use your eyes to pick up all of your reference points, and you can do that a bit more easily in here because of that cockpit surround being as low as it is, and because you can see that front wing. So the driver's job in this is a little bit more demanding, yet a little bit easier, simply because of the configuration of the car and generally the configuration of the 90s in general. It was a little bit simpler, more things were analog, more things were just simpler, to be honest. A lot of people look back to the 90s and like it. I happen to echo that sentiment. It's just very pure, yet still very fast. And it's just techy enough, because of that semi-automatic gearbox, mostly, and that high-revving engine, to let you know that you're still dealing with something that's very, very sophisticated and very, very fast. Do we hit 198? No, we do not. gets a little squirrely there out of the Fania chicane, making me run wide a little bit. No major problem. Big slick tires, that flat under tray, it's generating so much downforce at high speed. It's just glued to the road. And because of that flat bottom, the car tends to hunker down a little bit more than the modern ones do, because you can run that under tray essentially flush to the road surface. Just makes things a little bit more stable on the ragged edge. Back into the pit lane here. No adjustments to be made with things like MGUs and stuff like that. Just back into the pits. Stop in front of the pit box and switch it off. Easy as you might like. So that's the FW14. It is a much more pure driving experience than a modern one. However, the modern ones have a flavor and appeal all their own. A lot of that comes from speed, but some of that also comes from just the technicality of these cars. Because they are so complex and because they do require a bit of studying and certainly a lot of practice to really start to get yourself acquainted with them, when you do start to get fast in the modern cars, they are also very rewarding in a different sense than these are. These are pure, these are very driver focused, and good drivers will excel in these. Good drivers will also excel in a modern one, but it's not good enough anymore simply to be fast and simply to have a good instinctual feel for a car. In the modern ones, you also have to have a very good sense of what's going on under the skin so that you can best exploit the car's full potential. And we will see that next when we have a look at Formula Hybrid. Welcome back to Spa, and this, of course, is the Formula Hybrid 2017. Although this car is fictional, it has been designed from the ground up to be a very realistic interpretation and representation of the 2017 Formula One technical regulations. Therefore, I say that it is the most realistic standard in Assetto Corsa as of this moment to the real-world conditions of 2017 in terms of car behavior and car dynamics. Therefore, we're using this as our test bed. We're not going to use any of the other attempts at 2017 mods that are out there at the moment. I do not feel that they are quite as polished and certainly not quite as realistic as Formula Hybrid is, although Formula Hybrid is not designed to emulate any real-world car as of right now. Obviously, you can see that there are some big changes on Formula Hybrid versus the FW14 that we were just in. However, you can see that there are plenty of similarities. You've got very large front and rear wings. You'll notice that this front wing is a lot more complicated and sophisticated than the wing on the FW14. Namely, you can see all of these different flap elements in it. I am counting 1, 2, 3 principal flap elements and then cascades on the outboard sections of the wing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cascade elements on each side, and then of course you've got the main plane of the wing there, which is a neutral section homologated in the FIA technical regulations. Those little Venturi tunnels underneath the wing on the FW14 have been replaced with these two inverted U channels on the outboard extreme edges of the wing on Formula Hybrid. This is also something that we're seeing in the real world, of course. On the rear wing, things are a little bit more simplistic. You will notice that there are basically two principal elements to this rear wing. Just like on the FW14, you have a small beam wing there on the bottom section, but then you also have the main plane of the wing, which also is complemented by DRS. The slot gap on this wing opens up, as you can see there, and that cuts drag down the straights. That's a feature that has been brought on since 1991, all those years ago, and that adds the first thing that we have to think about in the cockpit when we're driving this car. Speaking of the cockpit, we can go in here, and the engine is cut off at the moment due to fuel starvation, but you can see just how much things have changed over those 25 years in between these two cars. We have a steering wheel now, which really does not resemble a wheel as much as it resembles a yoke in the cockpit of an aircraft, and there's so much information on here. I've got lap time ticking away. Below that, we'll have a lap delta once we're underway. We'll have fuel level on the bar on the left-hand side. We have states of charge in the main battery reserves in blue, and in the battery reserves allocated for this particular lap in gold over on the extreme right-hand side of the screen there on the steering wheel. We've got a gear indicator. As you can see, we'll have a speed indicator. Right now it's reading 0. We'll have a rev indicator once the engine is running. We have tire pressures there. LF, LR, RF, RR there on the central portion of the screen on the wheel. So there's a whole bunch of information coming your way just by looking at the steering wheel. None of that is in the Williams. You get a rev counter, you get a speedometer, and you get a gear indicator, and that's it. You don't see tire pressures or states of charge on anything, so there's a lot more just to monitor visually here. Speaking of the visual proportions, though, of the cockpit, you can see that cockpit surround comes right up to the size of the driver's helmet, so no longer can we see the main plane of that front wing. We can only see the tops of the front tires, and that's about it. We can't see the nose at all, so we can only use our imagination to project where exactly that front wing is. The front wing is basically the width of the car's front track, so basically where the front wheels are is where the edges of that front wing are as well, just projected a couple feet ahead. So a little bit more mind's eye going on here, just trying to judge the overall proportions of a modern car. Going back into the pits here, we can put some fuel on board. We'll have a look at the setup as well. I've loaded my setup here from Barcelona because I don't really have one that I set up for Spa. I do, but I'm not quite happy with it. So you can see here what we are doing. First of all, the electronics section. This is something that you don't have at all in that FW14. This is for your MGU-K and MGU-H. So the MGU-K is your motor generator unit kinetic. This is what is charging off of the rear axle under braking. It's using the forward momentum of the car, which would otherwise be converted exclusively into heat via braking and a little bit of friction with the tires on the road, and it's capturing some of that energy and charging batteries. The MGU-K recovery setting is what is harvesting off of the rear axle. How aggressive do you want that recovery to be? It also acts a little bit as a second set of rear brakes, so you do have to manage that as you're going around in conjunction with your brake bias front to rear. MGU-H mode, that is the MGU-H, which is run off of the turbocharger, a little motor generator unit, which obviously being a motor and a generator, the motor side spools up the turbocharger, so it basically eliminates turbo lag. However, the generator side uses the momentum of the turbocharger further to charge the batteries or to exert a little bit of power into the crankshaft on the engine just to help with pickup out of slower corners. Aerodynamic side still rather simplistic from that, just the front and rear flap angles on the wings. However, going into the suspension adjustments, you can see a lot more adjustments are at our disposal here in Formula Hybrid than on the Williams, and you can also see the ride heights there. Ride heights on the rear very high, ride heights on the front very low. There's that rake setting that I like very much. You can see for Spa, I've trimmed out the rear wing quite a bit as well as the front wing because we've got some long straights on this circuit. So the Barcelona setup is more so on the chassis side. The aero side has been converted over for Spa. Less downforce because we simply don't need it quite as much, and we want to take advantage of those straights to pick up some good speed. So we'll put some fuel in the car here. This car is also quite a bit more fuel efficient than the Williams, so we won't be running out of gas in this thing. At least I don't think so. We'll put 40 liters in it. That should be fine. And we'll run on the soft tires here. Lots of tires also you can run in Formula Hybrid. Ultra soft, super soft, soft, medium, and hard. So we'll use the soft here. It's the mid-range of the compounds. I like it very much. You'll notice some very different sounds in this car versus the Williams. V6 turbocharged power unit in this car. You've got 1.6 liters displacement versus the 3 in the Williams. Semi-automatic gearbox as the Williams, but look at this. 8 forward gears plus reverse. So lots and lots of shifting in this car. This engine also does not rev quite as high as the V10 in the Williams. This one redlines at about 12,000. The Williams will go all the way to 13.5. And some very different sounds accompany us as we blast down the Kemmel Straight for the first time. See our straight line speed here. At the moment, essentially identical, slightly faster to that of the Williams. However, when we start to play with some of the almighty settings that you have in this car, you'll start to understand why this one is a lot more demanding from a technical standpoint. I'm not sure how much is going to be picked up by my headset mic, but you may be able to discern a very audible click from my paddles here as I change gear. That's because we've shifted rims. I'm now using the Ferrari Formula 1 rim by Thrustmaster simply because that one has a lot more buttons that I can map to the functionalities that you need in Formula Hybrid. There are a lot of them, as we shall very shortly see. Notice some force feedback clipping there as we go through some of the fastest corners. Not a whole lot I can do about that because I do like the feel of it at lower speeds, so it's just something that I contend with. Still perfectly manageable. Into the DRS zone, and DRS is open. That's the first thing that you've got to manage on this car versus some of its predecessors. DRS, yes, it's only one button on the steering wheel, or some people, depending on what your setup is, and in Formula 1 there are many different approaches to how the drivers actually manage DRS with their control inputs. I have it mapped to a button here on the steering wheel. Many Formula 1 drivers like that. However, there have been some systems in the past with using a quasi-third pedal setup or using a paddle on the back of the steering wheel. Whatever you like as a simmer and whatever the drivers like in reality is what they will do to manage that DRS and many of the other systems on these cars. In terms of the overall approach to driving, though, when you boil it down, it's effectively unchanged from the Williams. The idea is to make this thing go around the track as cleanly and as quickly as possible. However, your sight lines, as we mentioned before in the pit lane, in this car are very different from what you had in the Williams. In the Williams, you had a lot more peripheral vision, so to speak. You could see around the sides of the front end of the car. Here, you really can't. You're just looking over the top of the monocoque, and you're using your imagination to project where the nose is. You can't see it, obviously, and you really can't see much of your tires either. You can just see the tops of them, and that's about it. So you've just got to be very confident in your abilities and spatial reasoning and spatial judgment to know where your front wheel is, particularly into braking zones if you want to clip some of the curbing. Starting our second flying lap here, we can start to play with some more settings. As you saw earlier in the video, looking at the steering wheel here, particularly the Ferrari rim, I have a lot of different things that I can adjust on the fly here in this car, and you've got to know what each of them does so that you can extract the maximum performance potential from all of these systems. So here we're going to start to play with the MGU recovery. That's at 100% right now. I had switched it off during the warm-up, but now we're back up to 100%. So that's harvesting off of the rear axle under braking to help charge the batteries. The batteries are at 100% capacity right now, so that energy is essentially being wasted as it would be traditionally, but you'll see that blue bar start to tick up once we start to use some of that electrical power. The other side here, we've got buttons for traction control on the wheel here, but no traction control in this car, so they are essentially redundant. But we now have settings here for MGU delivery. We've got charge, low, medium, high, and then you've got all sorts of qualifying maps, including one for Spa that we will go into. Additionally, across the bottom of the wheel, as you saw before, you've got the MGU H mode battery, so that'll use the turbocharger to charge the battery, and motor, which I prefer to run in, which will use that MGU H energy to throw it back into the engine to throw some more torque onto the crankshaft to help with pickup out of low-speed corners. Depends on your situation in the race or in a qualifying situation, whether or not you're trying to save some electrical power or harvest a little bit more in conjunction with the rear axle, but all of that needs to be managed very adeptly during a race. We'll go into our Quali Spa map, and you'll see the difference in pickup. That 196 miles an hour coming into the apex of Eau Rouge, exit at 194. DRS, over 200 miles an hour. Manual ERS, little bit more grunt now. 208 miles an hour before the braking zone into Les Combes. Very consistent brakes on this car, I must say. A bit more manual ERS deploy again. That's a half a second faster through the first sector alone. It's the 8th gear here through Bouhon. Another 4/10 picked up in a single corner. But now you can see in this qualifying map that gold bar on the right side of the steering wheel, we're almost depleted of electrical power for this lap, so that means we've got to dial back the MGU a bit here to make sure we're going to make it to the end of the lap. I just have one increment of electrical power left for this lap, so that means we're going to conserve it for the start-finish straight. We'll use the manual KERS deploy in conjunction with DRS. Out of power, and we cross the line 147.176. So many things going on here as you play with the settings across a single lap. So you've just got so many things to think about, so many things to monitor, and then so many things to do in the cockpit. As you're going through a race stint, you might run into problems with your energy consumption or your energy harvesting. How much are you doing on either side? Do you need more? Do you need less? So all of these things start to factor into how you use the car's systems. And just the amount that I'm talking about all of it, it just gives you some sense of how complex these cars are to manage. And then, of course, you've got to make sure that you're driving it well. When you couple all of those systems together with 19 other cars around you, these 2017 Formula One drivers have a lot on their plates. Next lap I'm going to do something a little bit difficult, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it, but I'm going to try to narrate all of the switch changes and things that I'm having to do over the course of a lap. So right now we're charging the MGU, recovery up to 100%. We're going to leave it at 100% for the start-finish straight and La Source because I do need a lot of braking into that first corner. DRS, gear shift, 4, 5, 6. Check brake bias, 56 to the front, 7. Brakes. Down the gears. There we go. Up into qualifying mode for Spa. Manual KERS deploy a little bit just to get us up into 7th gear. Let the computer sort out the rest now at the quali map for Spa. Eau Rouge up into 8th gear. Over the top of Rédillon. Little bit aggressive over the exit curbs there, no problem. DRS. Manual ERS. Off manual ERS. Downshifts galore into 4th gear, 3rd gear. 4th, 5th. Checking our recovery settings, going down to 60%. Don't need quite as much braking here. 4th gear, apex on the throttle. 5th, 6th, 7th, manual ERS a little bit. 8th, little lift, throw it into the corner. That's glorious. Look at that. Cornering speed. a good 15 miles an hour faster through Pujon than the FW14. Fifth gear, a little bit more recovery now, 80%. Fifth, sixth, seventh, a little bit of manual ERS, not too much. Eighth, dial our settings back now to charge mode. Got to make sure we reach start finish without running out of electricity. A little bit of manual ERS. Brakes down through the box into second gear. Hit the apex, squirt the throttle, squirt the brakes, hit the apex, squirt the throttle, not too much. DRS, manual ERS across the line, 147, 192. We're in charge mode now, going up to 100% for recovery for the cooldown lap. So that's pretty hectic, and that's a single lap in this car at Spa. For a race situation, Formula One driver is going to do that 44 times. That's a lot to handle. That's really a lot to handle. And in all of this time, I haven't talked about how the car actually feels to drive. I guess it's okay that a driver has a lot more ancillary work to do nowadays because the cars just are so stable. I mean, look at this. I turn the wheel once, and it does exactly what I need it to do. It's not like the Williams where you're juggling the steering a little bit, juggling the throttle. This thing just, you give it an order, and it carries it out. No problem. Flat here through Pujon. Even though we're in charge mode on the MGU systems, no problem whatsoever. Absolutely crazy amount of performance just out of the chassis in this thing. In terms of accessibility, though, this car is not what I would call accessible. There are so many systems here that you've got to know, and you've got to be intimate with them in terms of not only their functions, but their operation, because they really do affect the pace. That lap was 1.5 seconds slower simply because I changed my MGU settings. Buttons and switches and rotary switches. That is the difference between a fast lap and a slow lap in this car. You can change nothing at all about your driving style. If the settings in the car are not in the right place, you're not going to be fast. So that's just another thing that you've got to think about. Now, we can have the debate whether or not that is driver skill. Yes, a driver should be well acquainted with his equipment and he should know how to use it most properly, but if having a switch position in the wrong spot is the difference between Nico Rosberg winning or Nico Rosberg being taken out of the Spanish Grand Prix, that's pretty significant, I must say. And that's something that the fans have no idea about. You can't see that, really, unless you have very keen eyes, and even at that, the TV cameras have to be covering it at the right time. So these are things that are squarely on the driver's shoulders, and we fans, just watching from the outside, have no idea what they're doing at any given time. That just adds a little bit to the mystique and the allure and aura of Formula One nowadays, but at the same time, is that driver's skill in the sense of something that amazes us and makes us say, wow, I couldn't do that? Or is that somebody having to monitor a computer system? A little bit of both, I would say. Back into the pits with us. Here we are. Confirmation of our settings here. And switch off. Well, that is basically, as far as I can discern from a macrocosmic, big picture driving sense, the difference between a car 25 years ago and a car today. Formula Hybrid, indicative of a 2017 Formula One car, so complicated in terms of all of the things that you have to know on your steering wheel and in the car, all of the functions that you have at your fingertips, and you have to know how to use them and how they operate and how to blend all of them together to produce the best possible performance here. On my steering wheel here, I am counting 25 buttons and switches and rotary switches and things that I just have to know about in order to make this car go fast. And this is a stripped down version of a real Formula One steering wheel where they could have 100 or so individual or blended functions to play around with while they're out there in a Grand Prix or trying to put down a qualifying lap. You just didn't get that back in the 90s, and it's indicative of progress. Yes, it is. Technology has moved on by leaps and bounds in that 25 years, that quarter century, but at the same time, it adds more elements to racing that are not exactly racing. And maybe we can have a debate about that if you would like. And it's not something that I intended this video to be. Basically, this is just meant to be a bit of fun and maybe a little bit of information for you guys. But generally speaking, these Formula One cars, they are technological works of art. They really are. But they have more in common nowadays with fighter planes than they do automobiles. And we can say that's a good thing. We can say that's a bad thing. I personally think it's a good thing because I think fighter planes are pretty cool. But some people don't like it, and I completely understand where you're coming from because this steering wheel is a computer, and it's not something that you have in your road car and or anything like that. But it's also making the car so much faster. 1.5 seconds roughly is what that MGU system is worth on a really fast lap. If you turn it off, like I did for the second to last lap there before our in lap, you're 1.5 seconds slower just by turning a system off. So that is where the difference comes in. You've got to know what these systems are, and you have to know how they work and how to use them in order to get the most out of your lap time in a qualifying situation, and how do you maintain your position and go fight for further positions in a race. So I hope that all of that was at least entertaining for you, if not a little bit informative. Little idea out of the blue just to try and show you some contrast really between old and new. There aren't too many new mods coming out in this particular moment, so that's part of the explanation as to why I've been a little bit absent in terms of reviews and other commentary videos, but hopefully this was something that gave you a little bit of information and, at very least, was some fun for all of you to watch. Until next time, I do thank you all very, very much for your continued support and your continued engagement. I've seen that the subscriber list continues to grow. We're up to about 2,250 subscribers from my last look a few hours ago. So thank you all very, very much for that. It's greatly exciting for me, and it's also greatly humbling to know that many of you have made my work a part of your daily routine, and I certainly have no inkling, no wanting to stop anytime soon. So thank you all very, very much for your continued support, your engagement, your patience, your indulgence, all of that. So I'm having a lot of fun doing that, and I want to continue for a long time to come. However, until next time, Ferrari Man 601, thank you very, very much, and we will see you soon.